Good morning again, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to see everybody. The title of the message today is, Do You Believe in Your Soul? So we'll begin by asking the question of, do you believe in your soul?
Yes.
Yes, a lot of yeses. And any no's? Abstentions. If you believe in your soul, in my mind, not only does it mean the regular kind of stuff that means, that you believe that there's part of your essence that was before you were here and is around after your body passes away, but it also means that your emphasis and what you value most and what's most important to you about your life changes as well. What is the soul? It's a very important metaphysical question, and I'm not going to pretend to know the answer. For many, the soul is a little ball of light that's within everybody, and that's your soul, and it's in this body. Perhaps it's in other forms that you have that you can't see with your human eyes as well. For a lot of folks like Ernest Holmes, your soul is kind of like your aura. It's not something that's inside of you, it's something that surrounds you. And Heraclitus, an ancient Greek philosopher, said that the soul is dyed the color of its thoughts. So it's the idea, as Holmes would express, that the soul is our individual use of universal mind. That the soul both brings us into creation, but also gets something out of our creativeness, how we choose to show up in life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a great influence on Holmes, said, "All goes to show that the soul in man is not an organ, but animates and exercises all the organs. Is not a function like the power of memory, of calculation, of comparison, but uses these as hands and feet. Is not a faculty, but a light. Is not the intellect or the will, but the master of the intellect and the will. Is the background of our being, in which they lie, in immensity not possessed, and that cannot be possessed." All the definitions of soul that I know, of course, include this idea of a part of you that always was and always will be. But I love the idea as well that it doesn't just express our individuality, but it can contain others as well. I love the idea of the soul mate, for example. Or when you meet someone, it's like your soul has known them always. And I like this idea as well, that the soul must both be absolutely one with a greater source, yet also incredibly unique and distinguishable. You know, if we're in some other realm where we don't have bodies, how do you know somebody's somebody, right? It's easy to pretend being somebody else. It reminds me of the old joke about the white man and black man that grew up and they were best friends, but they argued all the time about whether God was a white man or a black man. And this argument continued their whole life until the miracle took place one day where they both died at the same time. And they both found themselves in heaven outside of God's waiting room, very excited and eager to see which one of them was right and which one of them is wrong. They walk into the office and God is there, and she turns around and she says, "Buenos dias, señor." The idea, of course, behind the joke being that you can't put God in a box, but nor should you put our own souls in a box either. We are many colors, many shapes, many, perhaps more than one character as well. We should never limit ourselves or what our soul is or can be, and that's maybe why we shouldn't give a set definition of what soul is. The best way to describe soul for me is simply essential self. Your soul is your essential self. And when your soul is the emphasis of your life, you realize that who you are is more than your accomplishments. It's more than your bank account. It's more than where you've been or what you've done. It's the very essence, the very spirit of who you are. It is a representation of your connection to what is most sacred to you. I think our soul as well represents our calling. Our soul is why we are here. It is those most ideal themes of love and beauty and wisdom and trust and integrity and grace that we seek to experience in the world, and through our soul we learn to the best of our ability, become these qualities that we seek to express and embody. One of my favorite ministers that's been in our movement for a long time is Margaret Stortz, and she was up in Oakland for a long time, and she just turned 80 years old, and I love that she has a blog. So any 80-year-old that has a blog is pretty cool in my book. But she just wrote in her blog about the experience of turning 80, and I really enjoyed what she had to say. And I have a lot of friends here in this church who have the experience of turning 80, and her blog starts off sharing a similar experience as I hear from my friends here, that they've learned now to measure their lives not in years but in decades, that they're not sure if turning 80 is more of an accomplishment or more of a shock. And she expresses, like many of my friends here, that upon the day of turning 80, do you mind me looking at you while I'm saying this, Victoria? I look into the mirror and I say to myself, what the hell happened? So Storch shares that, and then I think she gives us a bit of her soul. She says, I have lived long enough now to have created a history of my own, and from it I have gained a thing called perspective. I have discovered that the gaps between my successes and failures have narrowed quite a bit. In some ways, they've almost evened out. Don't mistake me, though. The genuine loves have never dimmed, and the great losses still ache. But most everything else seems not quite as important as it once did. The job that didn't pan out is just a memory, and the man I thought I'd never forget, I can barely remember. And the key word for me there is perspective, because I think that's a key quality of this term soul. That soul represents a kind of perspective. It's a kind of sacred perspective. It's a kind of primordial perspective that sees things not through the lens of chronological tick-tock, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 kind of time, but sees life in a significance of our ability to appreciate who we are in this very moment and throughout the moments of clarity in our life. Perspective, to me, is to be soulful. She goes on, when I look in the mirror at the face I did not plan on, I ask myself, am I growing old? Then I remember a current TV ad that asks, doesn't growing old mean living longer? And if you know that commercial, you can see that annoying guy asking that. I think it's one of those Scott Wealth Management groups or something. This is a really, really good question. On the other hand, growing old is an established condition. Not much we can do about that. But growing older is a work in progress. Open-ended, not fully established, still malleable. Given my choices, I think I'll opt for the latter. And maybe, as Dr. Christiane Northrup suggests, I can become an ageless goddess. Yeah. So 80s here, nailed it, on to 90. So last week we talked about this idea that our lives are the greatest stories ever told. Not because we're the most egotistical individual in the world, but because it's your story, and because it's the divine story in you. And when we live our lives with an emphasis on our souls, we live our lives differently than we would seeing life as a rat race. The things that we look to experience and value change dramatically. In the book that I've written, Spiritual Narrative, I talk about the difference between a book and a spiritual narrative, a soul story. Another way of saying that is I describe the difference between seeing life from the rat race point of view or seeing life from a soul-centered point of view. So a book often seeks a book has a beginning, middle, and end. Our spiritual narrative does not. So a lot of people measure their lives based upon a beginning, a middle, and an end. With soul as an emphasis, we don't see a beginning or an end because our soul has no beginning and no end. A lot of us in our autobiography, we might like to say, well, I was born on such and such to so-and-so, and then I think I'll die sometime, eventually, and there'll be all this whooshing and happenings in between. But if you live with a soul emphasis of your life, life doesn't work that way. It's more like shuffle on your iPod than it is with a beginning, middle, and end. Life isn't so much where we start and where we finish. It's defined by those key moments, again, throughout our lives where we have clear realization of who we are, where we are conscious of the gift, the true gift and blessings of our connections and those we care about, and where we feel at one with something greater than ourselves. A book focuses on overcoming trials and solutions to problems that lead to specific outcomes. Our spiritual narrative uses trials and problems to realize its theme with no concern for outcome. In my everyday life, I care a lot about whether I succeed or fail. I care a lot about whether I win or lose. I care a lot about whether I stay together with someone or break up. But the soul's emphasis is something different. Our souls don't care whether we succeed or fail. They don't care whether we win or lose, or whether we stay together or we break up. Not that the soul may not have a plan for our lives, but the soul's emphasis is, did you embody the qualities you were seeking to embody? Did you stand and embody your truth to an even greater degree? Did you become more of who you are? As many people in this room have shared with me, your failures in many cases have been your greatest blessings. That breaking up led to a greater relationship. So it's not that the soul doesn't want the positive aspects for our being, but the soul helps us release an attachment to outcomes, to recognize an emphasis on embodying greater truth. That's why I've always found so profound the statement that Ram Dass made about healing after learning to recover from his stroke. He said, healing does not mean going back to the way things were before, but rather allowing what is now to move us closer to God. It speaks profoundly to me of someone who's sick, and sees the idea of being healing as a cure, as getting better, as being like they were before. Well, the soul wouldn't emphasize it in that way. The soul is, well, are you growing anyways? Are you becoming more of who you are? And sure, you may not like the outcome that takes place, but still, we can find grace because the soul is something that helps transcend that experience. Or as Viktor Frankl would say, that some of the best books are the unfinished. And he's talking about individuals in their lives, those who are taken from us too soon. Yes, they are taken from us too soon, but at the same time, often through these experiences in their lives, they become more a self than those of us who have a lot more time here in this experience. A book often seeks a balanced ending. Our spiritual narrative seeks a way of life. I know in my life I'm always getting way caught up in outcomes. As it's been said, I get way caught up in the pursuit of happiness that it becomes all about the pursuit, all about the chasing. And if I just drop it, the happiness would be right there, right? When we live with the emphasis on our soul, we're not so much attached to what's going to happen, but to how we will be no matter what is taking place. I'm reminded of those famous words from Gilda Radner in her autobiography that she wrote soon before she succumbed to a terrible cancer in her body. She says, I wanted a perfect ending. Now I've learned the hard way that some poems don't rhyme and some stories don't have a clear beginning, middle, or end. Life is about not knowing, having to change, taking the moment, and making the best of it without knowing what's going to happen next. Delicious ambiguity. And it takes a soul to get to that place of understanding, to not give in to the seeming appearances of chaos and disorder and not knowing in our lives, to recognize and embrace a mystery, a grace, a divine background of a wealth of wisdom that is there for us if we could only identify with it. Now, all this being said, it's not that I don't think the soul can't lead us to certain outcomes, because for me, my soul, although it's not a map, it's kind of like a compass. That if I'm wanting to make a decision or live in accordance with who I am, if I take a deep breath and I communicate with my soul, it will help me want to live in accordance with the values or virtues that I want to experience. I have a good friend from a small town in the Midwest, and his graduating class was about 25 people or so I was only so impressed when he told me he was the valedictorian and captain of the football team. But he was very brilliant, and he won all sorts of awards, not only in the city, but in the county and in the state, so much so that he was awarded a grant to go to any university in his state. In the meantime as well, he got an acceptance letter that he wasn't expecting from a university in California. And so here he was with this path that was made for him. There was articles in the paper in his small town. He was the pride of the town, pride of his family, pride of the state in the way that they were talking about it. But his heart had other plans. His heart wanted to say yes to this university in California that he wouldn't have a scholarship for, would have to take loans for, and yet he still said yes to it in a very courageous way, because after he did that, there were now articles in the paper about the kid who thought he was too good for his state, that he was going to California. And it's interesting when we make decisions for a virtue in our life that maybe our life isn't validating for us yet. We make that choice for love, or we make that choice for greater prosperity, and there's that sense of risk. And for my friend, I know it took a long time to move as that small fish into the big pond to find people that would realize that, of course, it's a no-brainer. Of course you should have chosen this path. And that's sometimes how the soul works. Sometimes it's the only thing that we can trust and believe in to follow and move on in our way. I love something Ernest Holmes says about nurturing our soul through prayer. He said, prayer is essential not to the salvation of the soul, for the soul is never lost, an important point to remember, but to the conscious well-being of the soul that does not understand itself. Emerson would say that my soul needs an organ here, will I not answer the call? And there's that idea as well that our soul is always there. It contains our highest and best virtues. And if we say yes to it, if we get in tune with it through whatever spiritual practice we can, it can help to guide us. It can help validate us. It can help us in our decision making. I remember I didn't ask her permission, so I hope she doesn't get mad at me, but I was at O'Malley's about 8 years ago with my little sister Mallory. Been drinking there for quite a long time. And she had this big choice to make about whether to go to grad school in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, Ireland. And it was a tough decision, and I didn't have any advice for her on whether to say yes or no, but I knew that choice of not choosing that she was in was going to really strain her. So I really wanted to support her in making a choice. So we talked and drank and talked and drank, and then finally at some point she said, yes, I want to go. And I'm pretty sure it happened this way. At that very moment, these 5 beautiful but very muscular women with funny voices came out onto the patio there, if you've been there. And they sat around a table. We were listening to them for a little while, and I decided I couldn't help myself and went over and introduced myself and asked them what they were there and what they were about. And they said, we're female rugby players from Belfast, Ireland. So it's not always, again, about life affirming for us that we're making the right decisions. It's the idea that when we do make a decision and make it with soul clarity, there's something about life that does begin to pave a way for us, that begins to show a way, no matter what the experience may be that follows. Carl Jung called this synchronicity. He defined it as a meaningful coincidence of 2 or more events where something other than the probability of chance is involved. This is the idea of the soul's calling, of our sense of calling, our sense of connection to something greater, our sense of why we're here. Now, these days, a good word for the soul might be that word we find in psychology of the unconscious. Have we all heard that term before? The unconscious. And there's a philosophical debate in psychology, and it's around this question: is the unconscious the result of what happens in the conscious mind, or is the conscious mind the result of what's taking place in the unconscious overall? The general Freudian argument is that our unconscious is the result, especially when we're a child, of experiences we can't quite process. And so they form in the unconscious as impulses and wishes and neuroses. Oh my, it goes on and on, right? Carl Jung came in with a slightly different perspective. He agreed with what Freud was saying, but he also thought that the unconscious was similar to what Holmes called the universal mind, that it was something that we could call psyche, that contained not just our mind, but the mind of the ages, the mind of all time, and that this unconscious is something that actually brings our being totally about. For me, I think it's safe to say that there's a little bit of both, but when you use the unconscious as a word soul, it leaves us with this question: is who I am the creator of my soul? Or is my soul something that creates and nurtures me along the way? The point that I'm getting at here is the idea that the soul is something, when we're open to it, that can act in our life in tremendous ways. People don't argue with the idea that the unconscious is working on our lives all the time. Anyone here have a habit? You know, whatever it may be. And a habit is something that we do, but it's probably more apt to say that it does us more than we do it. Or does anyone here have a behavior pattern that they always get upset when they catch themselves doing it? Maybe it's talking too much, or maybe it's dating jerks all the time and not realizing what it is right away. There's all sorts of patterns that we can fall into that it's probably more apt to say not that we do it, but that it does us. Well, I think it's true in the sense of us, with our soul, with our spiritual narrative, that there's this aspect of who we are that it's safer to say not that we do it, but that it does us. If you've ever fallen in love before, you didn't have the love, it's like the love had you, right? Have you ever been in a place of blissfulness or a sense of clarity? It's this aspect where our soul begins to have who we are. Not that we lose any of our sense or any of our control, but we have that spiritual experience of surrendering to a part of ourselves that's greater than we even know ourselves to be. And it can inform us with that deepest core value that we're seeking to express, create, and embody in our lives. That love, that creativity, that inspiration. I love something very simple. The friar Allred Squire said. He said, man does not have a soul, man is a soul. You do not have a soul, you are a soul. And when we begin to see ourselves, and we can still honor ourselves as a body or as a name or someone who has a chronological time on earth, but when we can begin to create and cultivate a sense of a higher self that is not alien to who we are, although it will always be mysterious, but we like being a little mysterious, right? It makes us more attractive. Victoria's nodding with me, okay. But we can open ourselves to a deeper realization and expression of this soul in our lives. So just taking a prayerful moment in closing, I just invite us to, again, ask ourselves the question, do I believe in my soul? And if the answer is yes, is there any way in my life that I may better live in accordance with this soul? That I may better listen to it? That I may better allow it to become who I am, present in my thoughts, my actions, my feelings, my relationships, and all that I do? Saying yes to a life centered in soul, we let go of some of the attachment to outcomes that we cannot control, but take ownership of those sacred values that have always guided us and have always allowed us to trust the path along the way. And so it is. Amen. Thanks for your time.